My name is Martha, and I am 67 years old. As a retired philosophy professor, I dedicated my career to moral truth and ethical principles. For decades, I consistently supported my cousin George through his endless personal and financial struggles, offering over $200,000 in aid over the years, always believing in his potential for redemption. I meticulously cared for my aging mother through her final years, ensuring her comfort and dignity in every possible way, believing with all my heart that her estate would be handled with the fairness and equity she had always taught us. Then just 3 weeks after Mom's peaceful passing, George arrived at my door with chilling calm and claimed that Mom had promised him her entire estate. Every single piece. The $150,000 worth of antique furniture she had lovingly collected over 50 years. The $100,000 in savings she had carefully preserved. He confessed to crippling debt of $200,000 with a $50,000 loan. Shark threat, hanging over his head like a sword. My children, Mark and Lisa, raged at me. "He's lying, Mom. You have to sue him." But George sneered back. "You have no humanity if you don't help me, Martha. My principles, my family, my very life were being torn apart. I felt profoundly alone, caught between my love for family and this blatant fraud. Yet as despair threatened to consume me entirely, something deep within me began to stir. My lifetime as an ethics professor had taught me that truth always finds a way to surface. What George, Mark, Lisa, and their lawyer didn't know was my secret weapon, meticulous personal journals detailing Mom's explicit wishes for equal distribution and crucial audio recordings capturing Mom's firm refusals to George's financial demands. My retired judge ally was waiting in the wings. This time, their insidious deception wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their shocking lack of humanity, protect Mom's true legacy, and redefine what family really means, but at an agonizing cost I never could have imagined. The morning after George's shocking announcement, I invited him to my home, hoping against hope that a calm, rational discussion might reach whatever conscience remained in him. Mark and Lisa came too, their faces already hardened with anger and suspicion. I had prepared tea and set out Mom's favorite cookies, the ones she used to make for George when he was young and troubled. I wanted to remind him of better times, of the love that had always surrounded him in our family. "George," I began gently, my voice trembling, despite my efforts to remain composed. "I know you're frightened about your debts. We all are. But you know in your heart that Mom never made any special promises to you. She always believed in fairness in treating all her grandchildren equally. That's who she was. That's who raised us both." George's response chilled me to the bone, his face twisted with a mixture of desperation and calculated cruelty. "Martha, you're losing your mind if you think I'd lie about something this important. Aunt always said she'd take care of me. She saw my struggles, my pain. She knew I needed help more than anyone else. My $200,000 in debt depends on this money. The $50,000 I owe to some very dangerous people depends on this. You have no humanity if you don't help me now. You're being a selfish old woman holding on to money that was never meant for you or your spoiled children." He went on to detail his debts with shocking specificity. The gambling losses, the failed business ventures, the loan sharks who called him daily with threats. His desperation was real, but it was being twisted into a weapon against everything our family had ever stood for. I watched this man I had loved and supported for decades transform before my eyes into someone I barely recognized. "George, please," I whispered, feeling tears begin to form. "You know Mom's heart. She valued fairness above all else. She would never have made a promise like that, especially not in secret. This isn't like you. The George I know has a conscience, has integrity. But before George could respond, my own son, Mark, exploded with rage. Mom, he's lying. This is outright fraud. How can you sit there and listen to this garbage? Sue him. You're being too soft, too naive. You're losing your mind if you let him get away with this theft. He has no humanity. This is our inheritance, not his. My children's future depends on this money. Lisa, tears streaming down her face, added her own painful words. Mom, please. We need this money for our future, for our kids' education. He's trying to steal from us from his own family. You can't let your sentimental attachment to George blind you to what's right. This is theft, plain and simple. Then Brenda Mark's wife delivered the most crushing blow of all. Honestly, Martha, your sentimental attachment to George is costing us a fortune. You're being a complete fool. Everyone can see what's happening here, except you. Wake up. The room fell silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. These were my children, my flesh and blood, speaking to me as if I were some doddering old woman who couldn't see reality. The pain was almost unbearable. In the days that followed, Mark and Brenda began actively researching lawyers, bringing me legal documents to sign, pressuring me relentlessly to sue George. They would call me multiple times a day, their voices growing more impatient and harsh with each conversation. Mom, you have to act now, Mark would say. Every day you wait, George is probably hiding more assets or spending more money. Meanwhile, George began sending me text messages that grew increasingly menacing. Martha, you know what's right. Don't let Mark and Lisa turn you against family. Bad things happen to people who break promises to dangerous men. You wouldn't want anything to happen to your comfortable retirement, would you? I found myself caught in a nightmare, pulled between my love for George and my duty to my children, between my mother's true wishes and the growing threats on all sides. My hands would shake as I read George's messages, and my heart would break each time Mark or Lisa looked at me with such disappointment and anger. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering how a family that had once been so close could turn so vicious so quickly. The woman who had spent her career teaching ethics and moral philosophy found herself in the most profound ethical dilemma of her life, with no clear path forward, and no one who seemed to understand the agony of her position. George's desperation soon revealed itself to be far more calculating than I had ever imagined. Within 2 weeks of his initial claim, he had hired Mr. Davies, an aggressive lawyer with a reputation for ruthless tactics in family disputes. The first threatening letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with all the cold formality of a legal document. Mrs. Martha Johnson, it began, you are hereby advised to cease all interference with Mr. George Patterson's rightful claim to the estate of Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. Any further attempts to contest his legitimate inheritance will result in legal action being taken against you for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But George's brazenness didn't stop there. He began publicly announcing his intention to claim the entire estate, including Mom's precious antique furniture collection worth $150,000. He told neighbors, mutual friends, anyone who would listen, that these were promised gifts from his beloved aunt who had always favored him. He even posted on social media about his inheritance, thanking his dear Aunt Eleanor for her generous final gift. The most devastating blow came when Brenda and Mark began circulating rumors throughout our extended family about my stubbornness and disregard for Mom's true wishes. They painted me as a bitter old woman who was selfishly clinging to money that didn't belong to her, who was too proud to accept that her mother had loved George more than her own grandchildren. It was during this dark period that I made a discovery that shattered my remaining faith in George's character. While visiting Mom's house to check on the property, I noticed that a small antique clock, a beautiful piece worth about $5,000, was missing from the mantelpiece. It wasn't part of the major collection, just a family heirloom that had sat in the same spot for 30 years. When I called George to ask about it, he didn't even try to deny what he had done. "Oh, that old thing, I sold it last week. I needed some quick cash for my lawyer's retainer. Don't worry, Martha. It's not like it was worth much anyway." The casualness of his confession hit me like a physical blow. Here was a man who claimed to be honoring his aunt's wishes, yet he was already dismantling her legacy piece by piece for his own immediate gain. The $5,000 he had received was already spent probably on gambling or some other foolish venture, and he felt no shame whatsoever. It was in that moment of crushing realization that I finally allowed myself to remember the most painful secret of my past. A secret I had kept for over 30 years, a sacrifice so profound that even now thinking about it makes my hands tremble with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. George had been 25 when the gambling debts nearly destroyed him. $80,000, an astronomical sum at the time, owed to dangerous people who made it clear that his life was in genuine danger. He had come to me, tears streaming down his face, begging for help, swearing he would change, promising he would never gamble again if I could just save him this one time. I was a young philosophy professor, then barely established in my career, but I had recently inherited a substantial sum from my paternal grandparents. Money I had planned to use for my own children's education, for Mark and Lisa's future. Instead, I quietly liquidated over $60,000 of my own inheritance, borrowing the remaining $20,000 against my salary, and paid off George's creditors. I told no one, not my mother, not my children, not even my husband at the time. I fabricated a complex story about George receiving a small inheritance from a distant relative, and I made him promise to never reveal what I had done. I believed I was saving his life, protecting our family's reputation, giving him a chance to start over. The cosmic irony was unbearable. The man I had sacrificed so much to save was now trying to steal from the very family I had nearly bankrupted to protect him. When I tried to subtly allude to my past sacrifices during one of our increasingly hostile conversations, George's response was like a knife to my heart. "Martha, you're always trying to make me feel guilty with your so-called favors. Your past choices are your own business. Mister, Davies says you're trying to manipulate me with old stories and emotional blackmail." Mark, who had been listening, actually agreed with George. "Mom, he's right. You're trying to play the victim here. Just let it go and do what's right for the family. Stop trying to make this about ancient history." The betrayal was complete. My own son was siding with the man who was stealing from us, dismissing my lifelong sacrifices as manipulation and emotional blackmail. To add insult to injury, Brenda took to social media with her own cruel commentary. "Some people just can't accept reality," she posted. "It's really sad when family members try to twist the truth for their own personal gain. Sometimes you have to cut toxic people out of your life, even when they're family." The final blow came when Mr. Davies called to propose a settlement meeting. His solution was breathtakingly simple and completely one-sided. I would immediately transfer the $100,000 in savings and the $150,000 worth of antique furniture to George. In return, George would graciously agree to sign a public statement about family harmony and respect for his aunt's wishes. It was extortion dressed up as legal negotiation, and everyone involved knew it. But they also knew that fighting it would cost me everything I had left, both financially and emotionally. The final act of betrayal came with the cold efficiency of a legal document. On a gray Thursday morning, exactly 6 weeks after Mom's funeral, I received a certified letter from Mr. Davies' law firm. Inside was a temporary restraining order signed by a judge who had never met me based on fabricated claims of harassment and erratic behavior related to the inheritance dispute. The legal language was clinical and devastating. I was hereby prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my deceased mother's home, the house where I had spent countless hours caring for her in her final years. I was forbidden from contacting George, Mark, Lisa, or even my own grandchildren. Any violation would result in immediate arrest and prosecution. Mark and Lisa had actually signed affidavits supporting George's claims, swearing under oath that I had become increasingly unstable and threatening in my communications with them. My own children had branded me as a dangerous person who needed to be legally restrained from my own family. The public humiliation was immediate and complete. Word spread quickly through our small community about the crazy old woman who had been served with a restraining order by her own family. I could see the whispers and stares whenever I went to the grocery store or the pharmacy. The respect I had built over decades as a professor and community member evaporated overnight, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. In my heart, I still believed that love could somehow penetrate the greed and cruelty that had consumed my family. I spent hours creating a small personal photo album filled with precious memories. Pictures of Mark and Lisa as babies, family Christmas mornings, birthday parties, graduations, vacations. Moments when we had been truly happy, when love had been the only currency that mattered in our family. I wrote a heartfelt letter to accompany the album, pouring out my unconditional love for my children, despite everything that had happened. I reminded them of the values I had tried to teach them, the importance of family, the difference between right and wrong. I told them that no amount of money was worth destroying the bonds that had taken a lifetime to build. Late one evening, I drove to Mark's house and left the album on his doorstep, hoping that when he saw those cherished memories, something in his heart might soften. For 3 days, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, my gesture would reach him. Then I saw Brenda's social media post, and my heart shattered beyond repair. The photos showed my carefully crafted album, torn and cut into pieces, scattered across what looked like a trash can. The caption read, "Cleaning out the clutter. Some people just can't let go of the past, moving forward from negativity and desperate attempts to manipulate. Toxic family, moving on, no looking back." Seeing those irreplaceable memories, those moments of pure joy and love destroyed and thrown away like garbage, was more than I could bear. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor of my kitchen, sobbing uncontrollably. The realization that my own children had actively participated in this ultimate act of erasure, destroying cherished photographs that could never be replaced, confirmed the complete and final nature of their betrayal. George's response was swift and merciless. Within hours of Brenda's post, he sent me a brief, chilling text message. "Consider this closed, Martha. You tried. You lose. Don't contact me or my family again. Ever. You're crazy if you think you can win this." But the cruelest cut of all was yet to come. Brenda began calling mutual friends and distant relatives, spreading rumors that I was mentally unstable and obsessed with money. She painted a picture of a deranged, bitter old woman who couldn't accept that her mother had loved George more than her own grandchildren. It was then, in my darkest hour, that I finally revealed the most painful secret of all to my compassionate family mediator, ally Sarah. My mother, knowing of George's past financial irresponsibility and his tendency to make false claims, had done something extraordinary in her final months. Using an old camcorder I had given her years earlier, Mom had recorded a private video testament. In it, she sat in her favorite chair, looking directly into the camera with the clear eyes and strong voice I remembered from my childhood. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, explicitly reiterating her wish for equal inheritance among all her grandchildren. She expressed her deep love for George, but set firm boundaries regarding his financial irresponsibility. Most heartbreaking of all, she looked directly into the camera and said, "Martha, my dear daughter, if you're watching this, it means George has probably tried to claim more than his fair share. Please don't let him. I love him, but I won't enable his destructive behavior any longer. Make sure my wishes are honored, even if it breaks your heart. Promise me." I had promised her through tears just days before she passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had made me swear to keep the video secret unless it became absolutely necessary, knowing that George would try to discredit it as my fabrication. The cosmic irony was unbearable. George was using my mother's death, her love, her memory, as a weapon against the very promise I had made to her. My deepest act of filial devotion had become his ultimate tool of manipulation. As I sat in Sarah's office, finally sharing this burden I had carried alone for months, I realized that my fight was no longer just about money or inheritance. It was about truth, about honor, about the promise I had made to a dying woman who had trusted me to protect her legacy from those who would exploit her love. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a cold, righteous anger burning in my chest. They had taken my family, my reputation, my peace of mind. But they couldn't take the truth, and they couldn't break a promise made in love to someone who had trusted me with her dying breath. In the weeks that followed the restraining order and the destruction of my photo album, I found myself trapped in a psychological prison that was more terrifying than any physical confinement I could have imagined. The weight of Mom's secret video, combined with the legal prohibition against contacting my own family, created a suffocating isolation that pressed down on me like a living thing. Every morning, I would wake up in my small apartment and remember anew that I was utterly alone with the truth. The monumental secret of my mother's final wishes burned inside me like acid eating away at my sense of reality and purpose. For 40 years, I had been a truth seeker, a mediator, someone who helped others navigate ethical dilemmas. Now I was drowning in the most profound moral crisis of my life with no one to turn to and no clear path forward. The isolation was made infinitely worse by George and Mr. Davies's escalating public campaign against my character. What I didn't realize at first was how systematically they were working to destroy not just my family relationships, but my entire professional legacy as well. Mr. Davies began what he called a concerned inquiry into my mental state, subtly leaking details about my erratic behavior to university philosophy departments and ethics associations. He painted a picture of a once respected professor who was now experiencing cognitive decline, someone who had developed unstable fantasies about fairness and justice. He suggested that my years of teaching ethics had somehow warped my perception of reality, making me unable to accept that my mother might have genuinely favored George. The impact was swift and devastating. Quietly, without any formal announcement, I began receiving polite, but firm cancellations from academic groups where I had been scheduled to speak. Professional organizations stopped including me in their correspondence. A philosophy journal that had been planning to publish my essay on family ethics in elder care suddenly found space constraints that prevented its inclusion. My reputation for ethical rigor and intellectual honesty, built over decades of careful scholarship and principled teaching, was being systematically obliterated. Colleagues who had once sought my advice now avoided my calls. The university where I had taught with distinction for 30 years treated me like a pariah, as if my very presence might contaminate their reputation. The financial consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The escalating legal fees from defending myself against George's inheritance claim, combined with the costs of fighting the restraining order, completely drained my savings account. When my bank accounts were frozen, pending the estate dispute, I found myself unable to pay even basic living expenses. The eviction notice came on a cold Tuesday in November. I stared at the legal document written in the same cold clinical language as the restraining order and realized that I was about to lose the last physical connection to my independent life. Within 30 days, my cherished home, filled with books and memories and the accumulated treasures of a lifetime, would be sold at public auction to cover my legal debts. The day of the auction was the most humiliating experience of my 67 years. I stood across the street, watching strangers rifle through my possessions, putting price tags on items that held immeasurable personal value. My mother's china, my father's books, the furniture I had carefully chosen over decades of building a home. Everything was reduced to lots and dollar amounts sold to the highest bidder. I ended up in a crowded, impersonal public shelter, sleeping on a narrow cot, surrounded by people whose circumstances had stripped them of dignity, just as mine had been stripped from me. The irony wasn't lost on me that George, who claimed to be honoring my mother's wishes, had succeeded in making me homeless. But the cruelest blow was yet to come, and it involved the two people I loved most in the world, my grandchildren, Ethan and Chloe. Mark and Lisa, with Brenda's calculating guidance, decided to leverage my grandchildren in what they called a family harmony public relations campaign. They connected with a well-funded inheritance counseling group that was launching a national initiative about navigating complex family disputes. I learned about it the same way the rest of the world did, through a professionally produced video that went viral on social media. The setting was beautiful, a sunny garden with perfect lighting and soft music. Ethan, now 15, and looking heartbreakingly like his grandfather, stood at a podium delivering a rehearsed speech about navigating complex family inheritances and finding peace by letting go of unrealistic expectations. Sometimes, he said, looking directly into the camera with his father's eyes, we have to accept that our assumptions about family might be wrong. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is step back and let the adults make the hard decisions. The words were clearly not his own, but hearing them in his voice, seeing him used as a puppet to legitimize his father's betrayal, shattered something fundamental inside me. Chloe's contribution was even more devastating in its calculated innocence. The 13-year-old I had read bedtime stories to the little girl who used to curl up in my lap and tell me her secret stood beside a drawing she had made of a happy family. The picture showed Mark, Lisa, Brenda, George, Ethan, and herself all smiling and holding hands under a bright sun. I was nowhere to be found. "This is what family looks like," she said, her voice sweet and guileless. "When everyone lets go of the things that make them angry and just focuses on love." The video ended with a message about the importance of professional mediation in family disputes and the dangers of allowing elderly relatives to become fixated on inheritance issues. My own grandchildren had been turned into weapons against me, their innocent faces used to legitimize a narrative that painted me as the problem. I spent that night on my narrow shelter cot, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was how people lost their minds. The psychological torture of being legally separated from my family while watching them use my most precious relationships against me was almost unbearable. But just when I thought I had reached the bottom of despair, an unexpected lifeline appeared. The letter arrived at the shelter forwarded from my old address. It was from Dr. Rebecca Chen, a former student I had mentored nearly 30 years ago when she was struggling through her doctoral dissertation on applied ethics. She was now a respected professor herself, and she had seen the viral video of my grandchildren. Professor Johnson, she wrote, "I don't know what's happening in your family situation, but I know your character. The woman who guided me through the darkest period of my academic life, who taught me that truth and integrity are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high, would never be the person they're describing in the media." She included a check for $10,000 and the contact information for a network of retired legal professionals who specialized in elder fraud and ethical disputes. "These people believe in justice," she wrote. "Let them help you fight." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of the fierce determination that had carried me through 40 years of academic challenges and ethical dilemmas. I was not going to let my mother's memory be desecrated, my grandchildren be used as weapons, or my life's principles be twisted into something unrecognizable. The war was far from over, but I finally had allies, and I finally had hope. The next phase of George's campaign against me was so audacious, so perfectly calculated to destroy everything I held sacred, that I might have admired its thoroughness if it hadn't been aimed at obliterating my life's work. Using Mark's social standing in the business community and a network of ethically compromised academics whose palms George had apparently greased, he orchestrated something truly diabolical, a highly publicized national conference called Ethics in Succession and Family Wealth. The event was scheduled to take place at the very university where I had taught for 30 years, in the auditorium where I had delivered countless lectures on moral philosophy. The conference claimed to address the growing problem of inheritance disputes in American families, particularly involving elderly relatives who might be suffering from cognitive decline or unrealistic expectations about family loyalty. George was announced as the keynote speaker, billed as a case study expert in protecting true family wishes and navigating ethical challenges in succession planning. When I learned about the conference from Dr. Chen, who had seen the promotional materials circulating in academic circles, I felt physically ill. George was using my own professional arena, my own expertise, as the stage for my public execution. I managed to watch the live stream from a computer at the public library, sitting in a corner where the other patrons couldn't see the tears streaming down my face. George took the stage, looking distinguished and professional, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I had spent on food in 2 months. His presentation was a masterpiece of manipulation. Without ever mentioning my name directly, he told the story of an elderly academic who had become increasingly rigid in her moral thinking as she aged. He described how this woman's beautiful but outdated philosophical principles had made it impossible for her to accept her mother's genuine wishes for wealth distribution. Sometimes, George said, his voice carrying the perfect tone of sad wisdom, our academic training can become a prison, We become so attached to abstract theories of fairness that we lose sight of the human realities of love and family preference. This particular case study shows how dangerous it can be when someone confuses their professional expertise with personal wisdom. The audience of estate lawyers, financial planners, and family counselors nodded knowingly. Here was a man who understood the real world, who could see past the ivory tower delusions that trapped lesser minds. But the knife twisted deeper when Brenda took the stage for a panel discussion on family dynamics in inheritance disputes. She spoke about me with the practiced sympathy of someone who had rehearsed this performance many times. It's heartbreaking to watch someone you care about become increasingly disconnected from reality. She said, her voice heavy with false concern. Martha's principles were always beautiful in theory, but as she's gotten older, they've become more and more rigid. She simply cannot accept that her mother might have seen things differently than she did. It's tragic, really, watching someone who was once so brilliant become trapped by her own intellect. The moderator asked gentle leading questions about the challenges of dealing with elderly relatives who might be experiencing cognitive decline. Brenda painted a picture of a family torn apart by one person's inability to accept reality, a tragic story of academic brilliance curdling into stubborn delusion. But the most devastating moment came when they showed a pre-recorded video featuring Ethan, now 17, and clearly uncomfortable, but going through with his scripted lines anyway. My beloved grandson, the boy I had taught to think critically and question authority, spoke about his newfound appreciation for practical ethics and the importance of moving beyond abstract principles to real-world solutions. My grandmother taught me a lot about philosophy, he said, his voice carefully neutral, but I've learned that sometimes you have to look at what actually works for families, not just what sounds good in theory. Real life is more complicated than textbooks. The implicit message was clear. Martha's principles were outdated, academic theory, disconnected from the messy realities of human relationships. Even her own grandson had outgrown her naive idealism. The final twist of the knife came in a short video clip featuring Chloe, now 15, and giggling as she pointed at one of my old philosophy textbooks. Grandma used to read this stuff all the time, she said, laughing. So old-fashioned. We prefer practical solutions to real problems. The audience chuckled appreciatively. Here was the next generation freed from the rigid thinking that had trapped their elder, ready to embrace more flexible approaches to family harmony. I sat in that library chair, watching my life's work being systematically dismantled and used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral rigidity. The irony was unbearable. George, a man who had built his entire case on lies and manipulation, was being celebrated as a champion of ethical thinking. But just as I was about to close the laptop and flee from this nightmare, something unexpected happened. The camera panned across the audience, and I caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Dr. William Harrison, a retired philosophy professor who had been my mentor when I first started teaching. Dr. Harrison looked disgusted. His face showed the same expression of revulsion I remembered from faculty meetings when someone would propose compromising academic standards for financial gain. He was shaking his head clearly, seeing through the elaborate performance being staged on that platform. After the conference ended, I received an email that gave me the first real hope I had felt in weeks. Dr. Harrison had tracked down my contact information and reached out to express his outrage at what he had witnessed. Martha, he wrote, what I saw today was an abomination. Whoever orchestrated that conference has turned academic discourse into a weapon against truth and integrity. I don't know the details of your family situation, but I know your character, and I know when I'm watching a witch trial dressed up as scholarship. He offered something precious, a professional affidavit, vouching for my impeccable ethical judgment and mental acuity based on decades of professional collaboration. More importantly, he put me in touch with my retired probate judge ally, sharing his suspicions that something much darker was happening behind the scenes. The fight for my principles, my reputation, and my family's integrity had just gained a powerful new dimension. The truth was finally beginning to find champions who could help me expose the elaborate lie that had consumed my life. The final financial assault came with the precision of a military operation coordinated across multiple fronts to ensure my complete destruction. George, with Mark and Brenda's full support and strategic guidance, launched what he called his nuclear option, a devastating legal and financial attack designed to render me not just homeless, but utterly powerless to continue fighting for the truth. The first blow arrived in the form of a lawsuit so audacious that even my battle-hardened legal allies were stunned by its scope. George filed $1 million claim against me for emotional distress and intentional damage to reputation, stemming from what he characterized as my prolonged harassment campaign and malicious attempts to undermine his rightful inheritance. The legal documents, crafted by Mr. Davies with surgical precision, painted me as a vindictive old woman who had orchestrated a campaign of psychological terrorism against her own family. They cited my erratic behavior, my delusional insistence on my mother's supposed different wishes, and my manipulative attempts to turn family members against each other. But the lawsuit was only the beginning. While I was scrambling to find legal representation I couldn't afford, George launched a parallel attack on my remaining financial lifelines. He contacted my former university's administration and retirement fund managers with what he called grave concerns about my mental competence and my fitness to manage my own financial affairs. His evidence was compelling to anyone who didn't know the full story. He presented the restraining order as proof of my dangerous instability. He shared carefully edited recordings of our conversations that made my desperate pleas for honesty sound like the rambling threats of an unhinged person. He even provided testimony from Mark and Lisa about their growing concerns over my increasingly paranoid behavior and my inability to accept reality. The result was swift and devastating. The university's pension board, citing concerns about potential liability, voted to permanently revoke my retirement benefits. They characterized their decision as protecting the institution from association with someone who had been legally determined to be a threat to her own family. My professional honors, accumulated over 4 decades of distinguished service, were quietly stripped away under a clause about conduct unbecoming of a university representative. Within 3 months, I went from having a modest but secure retirement income to being completely destitute. The legal fees from defending against George's massive lawsuit consumed the small nest egg Dr. Chen had helped me build. The loss of my pension eliminated any hope of long-term financial stability. The eviction from my temporary shelter came on a bitter January morning, timed with cruel precision to ensure maximum humiliation. Brenda had somehow arranged for local media to be present, ostensibly covering a story about housing challenges for seniors with mental health issues. The footage that aired on the evening news showed me standing on the sidewalk with my few remaining possessions in garbage bags, a formerly respected professor reduced to visible homelessness. The reporter's voiceover was devastating. "This is Martha Johnson, a retired philosophy professor whose family disputes have led to legal troubles and housing instability. Local social services are working to provide support for seniors who may be struggling with the transition to retirement and the complex family dynamics that can arise during inheritance discussions. I watched myself on that television screen, standing in the cold with everything I owned in trash bags, and barely recognized the broken woman I had become. The dignified professor who had once commanded respect in lecture halls had been transformed into a cautionary tale about what happens when elderly people become fixated on inheritance issues. Mark and Lisa's response to my homelessness was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire ordeal. When reporters asked Mark about his mother's situation, he delivered a statement that Brenda had clearly crafted for maximum impact. "My mother is struggling with some difficult personal issues right now," he said, his voice heavy with practiced sadness. "We've tried to help her, but sometimes you have to accept that you can't fix everything. I have no legal or moral obligation to support someone who refuses to accept help or acknowledge reality." Lisa's response was even more calculated in its cruelty. She posted on social media about her incredibly busy schedule with work and family obligations, subtly implying that Martha's problems were self-created drama that she simply didn't have time to deal with. When she encountered me on the street near the shelter, she literally looked away and crossed to the other side, unable or unwilling to face the suffering she had helped create. But the cruelest twist of all came when Brenda decided to celebrate their victory with a gesture so audacious that it took my breath away. Using money that she and Mark had derived from my stolen inheritance, my rightful portion of the $100,000 in savings plus proceeds from selling Mom's precious furniture collection, she made a highly publicized donation to establish an ethics and family relations center at the very university where I had taught. The dedication ceremony was covered by local media as a heartwarming story of young people giving back to their community. Brenda stood beside a gleaming plaque that bore Mark's name as the primary benefactor, smiling for cameras as she spoke about the importance of practical ethics and moving beyond theoretical approaches to real-world family challenges. This center will help families navigate the difficult decisions that arise when theory meets reality, she announced. Sometimes the most ethical thing you can do is accept that your assumptions might be wrong and be willing to compromise for the sake of family harmony. The photographs were shared widely on social media, transforming my stolen legacy into a trophy celebrating their moral courage and commitment to family values. They had taken my mother's inheritance, used it to destroy my life, and then turned it into a monument to their own righteousness. The physical toll of this relentless assault finally overwhelmed my body's ability to cope. One morning in late February, as I was walking from the shelter to the library where I spent my days researching legal options I couldn't afford to pursue, my chest exploded with pain and the world went black. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital intensive care unit connected to machines that were apparently keeping me alive. The doctor, a kind woman about my daughter's age, explained that I had suffered a massive heart attack brought on by severe stress and malnutrition. My body, she said gently, had simply reached its breaking point. As I lay there in that hospital bed floating in and out of consciousness, I experienced something that felt like a vivid dream, but somehow more real than my waking life. I was back in my university classroom, 30 years younger, engaged in a passionate debate with my students about the nature of moral compromise. The question, I heard my younger self saying, is whether we can ever justify sacrificing fundamental principles for the sake of convenience or personal gain. When we compromise our deepest values to avoid conflict or to make our lives easier, what do we become? In the dream, one of my students asked, "But Professor Johnson, what if standing by your principles destroys everything you love? What if the cost of truth is everything you've worked for?" My dream self looked directly at the student and said, "Then you discover what your principles are really worth, and you discover who you really are." When I fully regained consciousness, I understood with crystalline clarity what my subconscious was trying to tell me. This entire nightmare, this systematic destruction of my family and my life, was the ultimate test of everything I had spent 40 years teaching. George's actions, my children's complicity, Brenda's calculated cruelty, they represented the complete embodiment of the moral compromises I had fought against my entire career. The memory of that classroom debate ignited something fierce and unbreakable in my chest, something that the heart attack couldn't touch. I was going to fight back not just for my mother's memory or my own vindication, but for the principles themselves. The truth was worth fighting for, even if it cost me everything I had left. From my hospital bed, slowly recovering from the heart attack that had nearly ended my fight before it truly began, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The machines monitoring my vital signs beeped steadily as I dictated what I knew might be my final message to the world. With the help of Sarah, the compassionate nurse who had become my unlikely ally, I recorded a video that contained everything I had been legally prohibited from saying. In that raw, emotional recording, I detailed George's ruthless manipulation, Brenda's calculated cruelty, and the systematic way they had weaponized my own family against me. I played the unedited audio recordings I had secretly made of George's initial inheritance, claims his desperate confessions about his $200,000 in debt, and his chilling boasts about how he had outsmarted our mother. But most importantly, I spoke directly to Mark, appealing to whatever conscience might still exist beneath the layers of greed and manipulation that had consumed him. I reminded him of his father's values, of the man who had raised him to distinguish between right and wrong. I spoke about his own struggles as a young man, the mistakes he had made, and the way our family had supported him through them, hoping to awaken some memory of the love that had once bound us together. "Mark," I said, looking directly into the camera with whatever strength I had left, "I know you're listening to other voices now, but somewhere inside you, you know the truth. You know your grandmother never made those promises to George. You know what we're really fighting about here isn't money. It's the difference between right and wrong. Please, son, don't let them use you to destroy everything our family stood for." Sarah, who had watched the entire recording with tears in her eyes, promised to personally deliver the message to Mark's home. She was as invested in seeing justice done as I was, having witnessed firsthand the cruel campaign that had nearly killed me. But what we didn't know was that Brenda had systematically bribed several staff members at the hospital to monitor my communications and report back to her about my condition and activities. The orderly who was supposed to deliver my message instead handed it directly to Brenda, who intercepted it before Mark could ever see it. What happened next was so coldly calculated, so perfectly evil in its sophistication, that it took my breath away, even after everything I had already endured. Brenda didn't simply destroy the recording. Instead, she took my raw emotional plea for truth and twisted it into the final weapon against me. Using digital editing software, she carefully manipulated the audio and video, altering the tone of my voice, splicing sentences together out of context, and adding ominous background noise that made my desperate appeals sound like the paranoid ravings of an unhinged mind. She cut my heartfelt reminders of Mark's childhood struggles in such a way that they sounded like threats and blackmail attempts. She altered the audio of George's confessions to make them sound like me, rehearsing fictional scenarios. Most devastating of all, she edited my direct appeal to Mark's conscience to make it sound like I was trying to manipulate him with false guilt and emotional coercion. The doctored video was then sold to a prominent national gossip news channel for a substantial sum, framed as exclusive footage that provided disturbing proof of my mental deterioration. The story ran with the headline, "Retired Professor's Delusional Hospital, Rants Reveal Dangerous Family Obsession." The edited version painted me as a dying woman consumed by paranoid delusions, desperately trying to blackmail her own son and defame her deceased mother's memory with elaborate conspiracy theories. The network's expert commentator, a psychologist who had never met me, analyzed my obvious signs of cognitive decline and my textbook pattern of elder paranoia. When Mark appeared on national television the next day for what was billed as an exclusive interview about dealing with a parent's mental illness, my heart shattered completely. My son, the boy I had raised to value truth above all else, sat in a professional studio and delivered a performance that Brenda had clearly orchestrated with surgical precision. "This is incredibly difficult for our family," he said, his voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "My mother was once a brilliant woman, a respected professor who taught me so much about right and wrong. But watching her deteriorate like this, seeing her become consumed by these paranoid fantasies about inheritance and family conspiracies, has been heartbreaking." The interviewer asked gentle leading questions about the challenges of dealing with elderly relatives who might be experiencing cognitive decline. Mark spoke about the difficult decision to seek legal protection from my increasingly erratic behavior and the painful necessity of stepping back for the sake of his own family's safety and peace of mind. The most devastating moment came when Ethan, now 17 and clearly uncomfortable, but following his scripted lines, appeared on camera beside his father. My beloved grandson, looking sad and worried, spoke about how much he loved me, but how frightening it had become to watch my mental state deteriorate. "I really hope Grandma can get the help she needs," he said, his voice carefully coached to sound both loving and concerned. "But right now, we just need to focus on moving forward and protecting the younger kids from this kind of drama." Lisa appeared in the same segment, offering subtle nods of agreement and looks of feigned sympathy, publicly reinforcing Mark's narrative and making it clear that the entire family stood united against my delusions. Her presence eliminated any possibility that viewers might see Mark's position as anything other than the consensus view of people who knew me best. The viral video and the television interviews created a perfect storm of public humiliation that reached millions of people. Social media exploded with commentary about the crazy professor who was tormenting her own family with inheritance disputes. The story became a cautionary tale about elder abuse from the other direction. What happens when aging relatives become dangerous to their own families? But in my darkest hour, when it seemed that Brenda's manipulation had succeeded beyond even her wildest dreams, an unexpected champion emerged from the shadows. Dr. Harrison, my former mentor, who had been quietly investigating the situation since the ethics conference, had been carefully analyzing the viral video with the same methodical approach he had once applied to academic research. His decades of experience with digital media and his intimate knowledge of my character had led him to some disturbing conclusions. Working with a team of technical experts, he had discovered irrefutable proof of the digital manipulation that had transformed my desperate plea for truth into evidence of my supposed mental illness. The metadata, the audio analysis, the video compression artifacts, everything pointed to sophisticated editing designed to distort my message beyond recognition. More importantly, his investigation into George's current philanthropic ventures had uncovered a pattern of financial fraud that extended far beyond my family's inheritance dispute. George wasn't just stealing from his own relatives. He was systematically defrauding multiple estates and charitable organizations using his newfound reputation as an ethics expert to gain access to vulnerable elderly clients. The evidence Dr. Harrison had compiled was substantial enough to interest federal investigators and powerful enough to finally give me the leverage I needed to fight back against the elaborate lie that had consumed my life. As I lay in that hospital bed, reading Dr. Harrison's preliminary findings on his laptop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year: hope. Not just for my own vindication, but for justice itself. The truth was finally beginning to surface, and those who had worked so hard to bury it were about to discover that some things cannot be destroyed, no matter how much power and money you throw at them. The real battle was just beginning. Dr. Harrison's evidence proved to be the key that unlocked everything. Within weeks of his preliminary findings reaching the right hands, I found myself at the center of a legal earthquake that would reshape not only my family's future, but the entire landscape of elder abuse prosecution in our state. The funding for my legal battle came from an unexpected source, an investment I had made decades earlier in a small technology company that had recently been acquired for an astronomical sum. The modest $1,000 I had invested as a young professor had grown into nearly $500,000 money I had completely forgotten about until the investment firm tracked me down through Dr. Harrison's contacts. For the first time in over a year, I had the resources to fight back with the full force of the law. My legal team was formidable. Judge Patricia Collins, a retired probate court judge with a legendary reputation for rooting out inheritance fraud. Dr. Michael Torres, a respected political sociologist who specialized in family power dynamics. And Amanda Rodriguez, an aggressive elder fraud attorney who had built her career on cases exactly like mine. Together, they launched a massive federal civil and criminal lawsuit against George, Mark, and Brenda for fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and national defamation. The case attracted global attention almost immediately. Here was a story that resonated with millions of families struggling with inheritance disputes, elder abuse, and the complex dynamics of aging in America. Media outlets from around the world sent reporters to cover what was being called the inheritance trial of the decade. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment when the truth finally exploded into the light. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity with overflow seating for media and the general public who had followed my story. Cameras rolled as Judge Sarah Mitchell called the session to order, and I felt my heart pounding as Amanda Rodriguez approached the evidence table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "we are about to present audio evidence that will demonstrate beyond any shadow of doubt the calculated nature of the fraud perpetrated against Mrs. Martha Johnson." The first recording was George's voice captured during one of our early conversations when I had been secretly documenting his claims. His words filled the courtroom with chilling clarity. "Martha, I know what I'm doing here. Your mother promised me that money, and I'm going to get it no matter what it takes. I owe $200,000 to some very dangerous people, and I'll say whatever I need to say to get that inheritance. If that means making you look crazy, so be it." A gasp went through the courtroom, but Amanda wasn't finished. The next recording was even more devastating. George, speaking to someone on the phone, apparently unaware that I was in the next room with my door slightly open. "The old lady is totally buying it," his voice continued. "She actually thinks I have some kind of conscience left. I've been working on this plan for months, ever since I found out how much the old woman was worth. Martha's too soft, too philosophical. She'll never have the guts to really fight me on this." But the most crushing blow came with the third recording, Mark's voice joining George in a conversation that revealed the depth of their conspiracy. "Look, Uncle George," Mark's voice said clearly, "Mom's always been naive about family loyalty. If we stick to the story about Grandma's promises and keep pushing the angle that Mom's losing her mind, we can probably get most of the inheritance. Brenda's already working on the documentation to support your claims." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about George's desperate greed. This was about my own son actively participating in a conspiracy to defraud me and destroy my reputation. When George was called to testify, the man who took the witness stand bore little resemblance to the confident manipulator who had started this nightmare. Confronted with the undeniable evidence of his own words, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble in real time. "Mr. Patterson," Amanda said calmly, "do you recognize the voice on these recordings?" George's hand shook as he gripped the witness stand. I was desperate," he whispered. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Those people I owed money to, they were threatening my family. I never meant for it to go this far." "So, you admit that you fabricated the claim about Mrs. Johnson's mother promising you the inheritance?" Yes, but..." George's voice broke completely. "I thought Martha would just give me some money quietly. I never thought she'd fight me on it. I never thought it would destroy everything." As the weight of his public confession settled over him, George suffered what could only be described as a complete psychological collapse. He began sobbing uncontrollably, his body shaking so violently that the bailiff had to steady him in his chair. The sight of this man who had terrorized me for over a year, reduced to a broken, weeping figure, was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Brenda's turn came next, and her attempted flight from the courtroom only made her guilt more obvious. She was apprehended in the hallway, her careful composure finally cracking as she realized that her elaborate manipulations had been exposed. The woman who had orchestrated so much of my suffering broke down in desperate tears, her role as the primary instigator laid bare for the world to see. Mr. Davies, the lawyer who had enabled so much of this fraud, was immediately taken into custody. His disbarment proceedings would begin within days, and criminal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice would follow. But the most devastating moment of all came when Mark was called to testify. Hearing his uncle's true voice, seeing George's public breakdown, and finally confronting the undeniable evidence of his own complicity, my son experienced his own profound psychological collapse. "Mom," he whispered, looking directly at me for the first time in over a year, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I don't know how I became this person. I don't know how I let them convince me that you were the problem." Mark began weeping uncontrollably, his entire body shaking with the force of his realization. "I helped them destroy you," he sobbed. "My own mother and I helped them destroy you. How do I live with that? How do I ever make that right?" Watching my son's public breakdown, seeing him finally understand the magnitude of what had been done, was almost unbearable. The vindication I had sought for so long was tempered by the profound sadness of seeing how completely my family had been torn apart by greed and manipulation. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Mark's anguished sobs and the gentle humming of the recording equipment that was capturing every moment of this family's complete unraveling. Justice was finally being served, but the cost was higher than I had ever imagined it could be. The court's verdict came down like the final judgment it truly was. Judge Mitchell's voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority as she delivered her ruling, speaking not just to the defendants before her, but to a nation watching and waiting to see if justice could still prevail in cases of elder abuse and family fraud. This court finds the defendants guilty on all counts of criminal, elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud, she announced. Mr. George Patterson, you are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 7 years. Your actions represent a betrayal of family trust so profound that it shocks the conscience of this court. George, still broken from his courtroom collapse, could barely stand as the sentence was read. The man who had started this nightmare with such confident arrogance was now a hollow shell facing the reality that his desperate gamble had cost him not just his freedom, but his entire future. Mr. Mark Johnson. The judge continued, her voice heavy with disappointment. Your betrayal of your own mother represents a particularly heinous form of elder abuse. You are sentenced to 4 years in federal prison with mandatory participation in psychological counseling programs. Mark's sentencing hit me harder than George's had. Watching my son led away in handcuffs, seeing him turn back to mouth, "I'm sorry," one more time before disappearing through the courthouse doors, was a pain that no amount of vindication could heal. Brenda received 3 years in prison and substantial financial penalties that would bankrupt her for life. Mr. Davies faced 5 years for his role in orchestrating the legal harassment that had nearly destroyed me. But perhaps more important than the prison sentences was Judge Mitchell's formal statement vindicating my character and explicitly dismantling the false narrative that had been constructed around my supposed mental decline. This court wishes to state unequivocally that Mrs. Martha Johnson's character has been completely vindicated, the judge declared. The evidence shows a woman of impeccable integrity who was systematically victimized by those closest to her. The narrative of her mental instability was a calculated fabrication designed to facilitate theft and abuse. Mrs. Johnson's lifelong commitment to ethical principles and truth is what ultimately brought this fraud to light. The formal restoration of my dignity felt almost as important as the financial restitution. For over a year, I had been painted as a delusional old woman, clinging to fantasies about family loyalty. Now the world knew the truth. I had been right all along. In the weeks that followed the trial, the letters began arriving. The first came from George, written from his prison cell, in handwriting that shook with desperation and grief. "Martha," he wrote, "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I'm begging you to understand how desperate I was. The people I owed money to weren't just threatening me. They were threatening my children. I thought I could take just enough to pay them off and make everyone happy. I never meant for it to become what it became. I'm broken, Martha. I've lost everything. My freedom, my family, my self-respect. I'm drowning in here, and I don't know how to survive this." Reading George's letter filled me with a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in his admission of guilt, but also a profound sadness for the cousin I had once loved, now destroyed by his own choices. I chose not to respond. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Brenda's fate was perhaps the most complete of all. Ostracized by what remained of our extended family and the community at large, she faced her prison sentence in complete isolation. Her calculated ambitions, her dreams of social status built on stolen wealth, had crumbled into bitter loneliness. The woman who had orchestrated so much of my suffering now lived in the kind of isolation she had tried to impose on me. But it was Mark's letter that truly broke my heart and began to heal it. "Mom," he wrote from the federal correctional facility where he was serving his sentence, "I've been in therapy every day since the trial, trying to understand how I became someone capable of betraying you the way I did. Dr. Williams, my counselor, says that admitting what I did is just the first step in a very long journey toward redemption. I know I can't undo the pain I caused you. I know I can't take back the year of hell I helped put you through. But I want you to know that every day in here, I think about the man you and Dad raised me to be, and I try to figure out how I lost my way so completely. The greed wasn't even really about money, Mom. It was about fear. Fear that I wasn't successful enough. Fear that I couldn't provide for my family the way I thought I should. Fear that I was disappointing everyone. When Uncle George offered what seemed like an easy solution, I grabbed onto it without thinking about the cost to you or to my own soul. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm working every day to become the man you deserve to have as a son. Maybe someday, years from now, I can earn the right to ask for a chance to make amends." The letter was raw, honest, and painful to read. But it also contained something I hadn't heard from Mark in over 2 years: genuine remorse and a commitment to real change. The most healing moment came when Lisa appeared at my door 3 weeks after the trial ended. My daughter, who had been so passive during the worst of the abuse, stood on my doorstep with tears streaming down her face and threw her arms around me. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I was a coward. I knew what they were doing to you was wrong, but I was too scared to stand up to Mark and Brenda. I was afraid they'd turn on me too, and I chose my own comfort over protecting you. I've been carrying that shame every day since this started." Lisa's apology opened the door to the most honest conversation we'd had in years. She told me about the pressure she'd felt from Mark and Brenda, about her own financial fears, and about how she'd convinced herself that staying out of the conflict was somehow neutral rather than complicit. "I want to make this right," she said. "I want to be the daughter you deserve to have during the worst time of your life. I know I can't change what I did, but I want to spend whatever time we have left showing you that I remember who you really are and what you taught me about right and wrong." The grandchildren's healing process was slower and more complex. Ethan and Chloe had been manipulated and used as weapons against me, and they carried deep trauma from watching their family implode so publicly. But with therapy and Lisa's support, they began reaching out tentatively, asking questions about what had really happened and expressing their own confusion and remorse. Grandma, Ethan said, during one of our first real conversations after the trial, "I don't understand how Dad convinced me to say those things about you. I know you're not crazy. I've always known that. But somehow they made me feel like I had to choose sides, and I chose wrong." Rebuilding relationships with my grandchildren would take time, but seeing the genuine love and confusion in their eyes gave me hope that the bonds George and Brenda had tried to sever could eventually be repaired. The victory was complete, but bittersweet. My stolen inheritance had been restored. The $100,000 in savings, the $150,000 in furniture, plus substantial damages for the emotional suffering I had endured. My reputation had been cleared, my dignity restored, my principles vindicated. But the cost had been enormous. My cousin was in prison, broken and alone. My son was beginning a long journey toward redemption that might never bring him fully back into my life. My family had been shattered and would need years to heal if it ever could. Still, as I sat in my reclaimed home, surrounded by my mother's furniture and my father's books, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 years: peace. The truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and the people who loved me were finding their way back to the light. 2 years after the trial that changed everything, I wake each morning in my meticulously restored home with a sense of profound gratitude that still surprises me. The house that had once been a battlefield of deceit and manipulation has been transformed back into the sanctuary it was always meant to be. Every room has been carefully returned to its original warmth and dignity, filled once again with my mother's antique furniture, my father's philosophy books, and the countless small treasures that make a house a home. The restoration process had been both practical and deeply therapeutic. Each piece of furniture reclaimed, each book returned to its proper shelf. Each photograph rehung on the wall represented not just the recovery of my material possessions, but the reconstruction of my identity and my sense of place in the world. My days now have a rhythm and purpose that brings me deep contentment. I've returned to teaching, offering a special course at the university called Applied Ethics for Life Transitions, designed specifically for older adults navigating the complex moral challenges that come with aging family changes and end-of-life planning. The classroom is always full, and my students often tell me that my real-world experience with ethical dilemmas gives my teaching a depth and authenticity that purely academic approaches cannot match. The letters from Mark continue to arrive every few weeks, and they have become a source of both pain and hope. His journey toward redemption is genuine and profound, marked by brutal honesty about his failures and a deep commitment to psychological healing that gives me faith in his eventual transformation. Mom, he wrote in his most recent letter, I've been working with Dr. Williams on understanding how fear and greed can corrupt even people who know better. I thought I was protecting my family by going along with Uncle George's scheme, but what I was really doing was protecting my own ego and my own insecurities about not being successful enough. I'm learning that real courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing, even when you're afraid of the consequences. You showed me that kind of courage during the darkest time of our family's history, and I hope someday I can develop even a fraction of that moral strength. While our relationship remains distant and will likely always carry the scars of his betrayal, there's something healing about watching him confront his failures with such unflinching honesty. Whether we'll ever have a close relationship again remains to be seen, but I've found peace in knowing that he's becoming the man he was meant to be, even if it took losing everything to get there. Lisa has become my closest companion and most treasured source of joy. Our relationship has blossomed into something deeper and more authentic than it ever was before the crisis. She comes to dinner twice a week, and we spend hours talking about everything from philosophy to gardening to her children's hopes and dreams. I think what happened to our family taught me the difference between being nice and being good, she reflected during one of our recent conversations. I spent so many years trying to avoid conflict and keep everyone happy that I forgot about standing up for what's right. You never forgot that even when it cost you everything. Lisa has become my advocate in ways I never expected, fiercely protective of my reputation and my well-being, determined to make up for the time when she failed to stand by me. She's also become my partner in the advocacy work that has given my later years such profound meaning and purpose. My grandchildren's healing has been the most beautiful surprise of all. Ethan, now in college studying psychology, often seeks me out for guidance and conversation. Our relationship has been rebuilt on a foundation of complete honesty about what happened during those dark years, and his insights into the psychological manipulation he experienced have helped both of us understand how families can be torn apart by skillful predators. Grandma, I've learned that being manipulated doesn't excuse the things I said and did, he told me recently. I'm old enough now to take responsibility for my choices, even when those choices were influenced by adults who should have known better. I want you to know that I see you clearly now, not as the caricature they tried to make you into, but as the strong, principled woman you've always been. Chloe, now 17 and preparing for college herself, has become my frequent companion on walks and shopping trips. She often brings her friends to meet me, introducing me proudly as my grandmother, the professor who fought for justice and won. Her young friends listen with wide eyes as I tell them about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and lonely. George remains in prison, and his letters have stopped coming. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he has withdrawn completely into himself, unable to face the magnitude of what his choices cost him. There's no satisfaction in his suffering, only a deep sadness for what might have been if he had chosen courage over cowardice, honesty over deception. Brenda serves her sentence in bitter isolation, her dreams of social status and material success transformed into a cautionary tale about the price of calculated cruelty. I feel no anger toward her anymore, only a kind of philosophical curiosity about how someone could become so consumed with image and status that they would destroy lives to achieve their goals. The most meaningful development in my new life has been my work as a national advocate for elder abuse prevention, using my story as a powerful example of both the devastation such abuse can cause and the possibility of justice and recovery. I've spoken at conferences across the country, testified before congressional committees, and worked with legal organizations to strengthen protections for vulnerable seniors. My memoir, The Truth Will Set You Free, A Professor's Fight for Justice and Family, became a bestseller and has generated thousands of letters from people who recognize their own families in my story. Many have found the courage to fight their own battles against financial exploitation and psychological abuse, armed with the knowledge that victory is possible and that their principles are worth defending. The meditation group I joined during my darkest days has become my chosen family, a circle of wise, supportive friends who gather weekly to practice mindfulness and share the insights that come with age and experience. These women have become my closest confidants, offering the kind of unconditional support and understanding that biological family members sometimes cannot provide. My home is often filled with laughter now, Lisa's voice in the kitchen as she prepares dinner, my grandchildren's conversations about their hopes and dreams, the gentle voices of my meditation group friends as we share tea and wisdom on Sunday afternoons. It's a different kind of family than the one I was born into, but it's built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine love rather than obligation and tradition. As I sit in my garden each evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I often reflect on the journey that brought me to this place of peace and purpose. The pain of those dark years hasn't disappeared entirely. The scars of betrayal run deep, and I still sometimes wake in the night remembering the terror of being homeless and abandoned by those I loved most. But I've learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the pain never existed. It means integrating the lessons of that pain into a life of greater wisdom, deeper compassion, and more authentic relationships. The woman who emerged from that crucible is stronger, wiser, and more at peace than the woman who entered it, though the cost of that transformation was almost unbearable. My life now is defined not by what was taken from me, but by what I chose to build from the wreckage. I have my principles, my dignity, my home, and most importantly, relationships based on truth rather than convenience or financial interest. I have found my voice as an advocate for justice and my calling as a teacher and mentor to others facing similar struggles. The victory was worth fighting for, even though the price was higher than I ever imagined it could be. Truth did prevail, justice was served, and a life of authentic purpose and meaningful connection is always possible, no matter how dark the circumstances may seem. Years have passed since that devastating phone call when George first announced his fraudulent claim to my mother's estate. And as I look back on the journey from that moment of initial shock to this place of profound peace, I'm struck by how completely my understanding of family strength and happiness has been transformed. My life today radiates an inner peace that was hard-won through the crucible of the most devastating betrayal imaginable. This house, once the epicenter of deceit and manipulation, has become a sanctuary filled with authentic joy. The laughter of Lisa and my grandchildren echoes through rooms that once felt like a prison of isolation and despair. Friends from my meditation group, colleagues from my advocacy work, and former students who've become lifelong companions regularly gather around my dining room table, creating the kind of chosen family that's built on shared values rather than accidents of birth. I've become a nationally recognized voice in the fight against elder abuse, my story serving as both a warning about the insidious nature of family financial exploitation and a beacon of hope for those who find themselves trapped in similar nightmares. The memoir I wrote has touched thousands of lives, and the letters I receive from readers often tell me that my experience gave them the courage to stand up for their own principles when family members tried to exploit their vulnerability. The greatest lesson I've learned through this ordeal is that my strength never lay in blind trust or family loyalty at any cost, but in my willingness to courageously confront profound deceit and fight for ethical clarity, even when doing so cost me everything I thought I held dear. I discovered that self-worth is truly unshakable when it's built on principles rather than relationships, and that authentic family connections are those based on mutual respect and shared values, not blood relations or inherited obligations. I carry no bitterness toward those who betrayed me so completely. George's desperation and Mark's weakness were tragic flaws that destroyed their own lives far more completely than they ever harmed mine. Even Brenda's calculated cruelty ultimately served to clarify what really matters in life and what doesn't. Their choices revealed their character, while my response to their betrayal revealed mine. To anyone listening to my story who recognizes echoes of their own struggles with family betrayal, financial exploitation, or the profound loneliness that can come with standing up for what's right, I want you to know this truth really does prevail, even when the battle seems hopeless. Integrity can be reclaimed even after the most devastating deception. A life of purpose and authentic connection is always possible, no matter how complete the destruction may seem. The spirit of resilience that carried me through the darkest valley of my life continues to sustain me in these golden years of advocacy and authentic relationships. My moral compass, tested by the cruelest betrayals imaginable, emerged not just intact, but stronger and more precise than ever before. The principles I spent 40 years teaching and a lifetime trying to live by proved their worth when everything else was stripped away. Most importantly, I learned that happiness isn't about having the family you were born into, but about creating the life you can live with integrity and peace. The woman who sits in this garden today, surrounded by people who love her for who she really is, rather than what she might provide them, is more content and fulfilled than the woman who began this journey believing that family loyalty was the highest virtue. Sometimes the most profound courage is found not in grand gestures, but in the quiet determination to keep fighting for truth when everyone around you has chosen the easier path of lies and compromise. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in refusing to become like them, no matter how much they take from you. I am 70 now, and I have never been more at peace.